I'm really excited today to be here with somebody who is really near and dear again to me. Um, yeah, I feel like I'm here to kind of like learn a lot in the process of this dialogue. But I want this particular person to really like introduce himself and maybe just talk a little bit about themselves before we actually deep dive into our conversation today. Um, could you introduce yourself to me, please, and to the audience as well?
Sure. My name is Tom or Thomas Breidenbach, and I have for some time been interested in parapolitics or deep politics, which is the emerging academic discipline concerned with the role of elite criminality in the practice of statecraft. And I got especially interested in it in the wake of 9/11. Um, I lived in Manhattan at that time. I still live in New York City. I lived in Manhattan for almost 10 years at that time. And so I was, less than 2 miles away from 9/11 when it happened. And I saw from the roof of my building a lot of the aspects of the event. And I ended up, I think, probably through my trauma, studying that event quite a bit, and eventually started writing about it to see if I could make some sort of contribution to the 9/11 truth movement, and that led to a long and winding tale, and here I am, over 2 decades later, still thinking about that event.
So you were a part of the early sort of skeptical group of folk. Because I think when I was at that point, right, I was actually pretty young, but I remember it. I like remember um, totally believing the news because like the idea of fake news had never entered like the zeitgeist. So my first thought was first, are my friend's parents okay? And second thought was never to question the news, right? So
Right.
but what I'm interested in though is what allowed a level of skepticism to seep in where for many others there wasn't that, right? We all sort of, I think the majority of us bought it pretty quickly. What
I
made you sort of have resistance to it in the very early stages of it all?
Yeah, I think probably it had to do with a number of factors, including how I was raised in a farming community in, rural and fairly conservative Northeast Colorado. Um, at least socially conservative Northeast Colorado, where there used to be a line in the old Peanuts cartoon with Snoopy and all, about how everything, I think, Lucy would say something to Charlie Brown like, well, everyone knows it's all run by an Eastern syndicate. Everything's run by an Eastern syndicate. And that kind of characterized, I think, how I was raised, with a conservative / libertarian streak out here in the plains where I'm actually now visiting. And so maybe that predisposed me to a degree to this kind of thinking. But it never really solidified. And when I went to college and grad school, I got the message pretty quickly that that kind of thinking was not in vogue, and I'd better drop it in favor of Marxist theory, if I wanted to fit in, and which I did, frankly, and found that was an intriguing theory for me, and but I never really entirely abandoned the idea. And then I think in the early part of the ACT UP movement, I just heard so many things from older people that I was friends with that suggested to me that conspiratorial thinking was not, there's no monopoly, not the sole province of the right or the libertarians. There was plenty of it on the left too, and including among the more militant aspects of the gay rights movement at that time. So I heard a lot about that. other things happened, like things with my family, and that caused me to really question the government. And even though I took a pretty hard left turn in my undergraduate and graduate school years, that continued, well, I would say into my 40s. I'm now 58 years old. That I, well, probably, if I'm being honest, my leftism probably continued until I was in my 50s. And, but I still just felt there was something wrong. And I listened to the, probably as an effect of my upbringing, I kept listening to the right when they would talk about these things. And I was intrigued by it. And I was always intrigued by events and issues that challenged the limits of perception, the limits of knowledge, the limits of how we know or think we know what we know. And so these things just intrigued me. And then I felt deeply embittered by the installation or selection, the so-called election of George W. Bush, which I felt was corrupt. And I just decided not to watch my TV anymore. And I remember a friend telling me, you know, Tom, this means there'll be a war. And I did know that because I had followed the Bush family fairly closely from a predominantly left perspective. I knew there would be a war. I just didn't know how they were going to accomplish it. And I was listening to the news and trying to be, politically aware. And my first reaction when I heard the plane come over, it didn't fly directly over my apartment in the East Village, but pretty close, the first plane. Some people say there were no planes. There were planes. And it flew over and I heard it. And from my, I was asleep at the time. I didn't have to work that day. And I heard this distant sound. It sounded like a dentist drill from a distance, and then it got louder and louder and louder, and it roared, not exactly overhead, but somewhat. And then
so that was the first plane you heard. The first plane.
And it powered down, and I remember as it kind of flew over where I was
a little too close for comfort there.
Yeah, I rolled over in bed as I remember.
Oh my!
And I thought, my first thought was, "There's the attack."
Oh my gosh!
Because there had been, testimony of Gary Hart, former senator and presidential candidate from Colorado. He had delivered, I believe it was Senate testimony, that there was an impending attack, and so there was all.
You were keyed in. So essentially, you heard the first plane, and your thought was, "Yep, right on time. There's the attack."
Yeah, there's
because
the attack.
Plugging into the narrative and been kind of doing your own little understanding around it before a lot of folks. So okay, wow.
And George W. Bush viscerally bothered me. I just felt there was something gravely off about this individual. So
he did seem sort of like a bit of I would say like an artifice. Like he felt in a way that Reagan didn't to me, in a way. Whatever Reagan's politics were, I remember him feeling authentic to me as a kid. And
I'm a farm boy, and
yeah,
when Bush was pulling all that routine, I just you're not a rural person. You're fake. And there's I can't stand disingenuous people, and I just saw him pulling off this Texas good old boy, which I think he liked being or pretending he was, but he wasn't now.
Wow. And so
Reagan would work on his farm. When Reagan would ride the horses and everything, it was real. Bush didn't have any clue what he was doing. Tried to show him in that Texas ranch, and he had no clue what he was anywhere. So.
But that aspect of your upbringing really launched you into a different path, you could say, because you come from, in many ways, I think, a very unique and specific place in the world, right? It's very rural. Not a lot of people, as you'd attest to say, Like, can you remind me again exactly where it is that you are now and where you grew up?
Yes, in northeast Colorado. It's not far from Nebraska border, not far from
So,
Kansas and Wyoming.
so very much the American deep cut.
Yeah,
I think you are. You're like,
we call ourselves Western, but we're right on the cusp of the Midwest. So
wow, wow, love those people. But so you come into New York City, right? And you dive into academia, it sounds like at a very early age, which is a very prestigious space. And you come from a very not so prestigious sort of upbringing with access to just like incredible, I'm sure, like, nature and wildlife, but not a lot of prestige in that essence. Whereas in New York, prestige is really the cash. It's like the cash flow in many ways. How did you stay true to yourself and also continue the journey with this? Because a lot of folks come to New York City and they're quickly trying to scrub off the history.
yeah,
What made you kind of find value there and decide to kind of, um, continue down that path of investigating things from a conspirial type of lens?
I think I just had always had a closeness with my family, and a kind of deep pride in my family
Wow.
that persisted even through the tremendous battles I had with my family. And I was raised with a very solid work ethic. And again, it was that deep family pride. And I think blood was just thicker than water, ultimately.
Right.
And I ultimately felt that my family was loving, for all their problems or faults or whatever. I felt that the underlying basis, and again, for all the feuds and whatnot that every family, goes through, there was this strong basis in love and compassion. So,
Wow. I mean, I grew up in my American part of my story took place in the sort of New England area. And I always remember there's sort of this coldness to the WASPy sort of households that I would enter into. And I'd always think, the kids would always long for a little bit of what you're talking about. And of course, they had like immense wealth and money. The fathers oftentimes came from a lot of prestige. And mom kind of like in many ways, was like a trophy. But the kids often felt like one kid mentioned to me that he thought he was like furniture in the home. No way. He was just another trinket for the family. So it sounds like you came from a very cohesive community. And so that kind of allowed, in some ways, it sounds like your imagination and your truth and yourself to kind of stay put. Whereas a lot of other folk ended up becoming very indoctrinated because they were seeking for some kind of fulfillment in a way.
I think my Catholic upbringing had something to do with it too, because there was a warmth in the religiosity that I was raised in, and it was also the power of the ritual and the grounding that gave me. Even though I, for many years rejected the church and fled from it, and fancied myself an atheist for a while, and
so let's go back a little bit, if you don't mind. Like I'm interested in, so let's flash back again to because I think it's going to tie into the Catholic faith in some odd way as well. But I want to kind of launch us there by revisiting 9/11 again, and I want to kind of like look at what happened after you rolled out of bed, and what were the protests like at that time period with the people that you're around that kind of were like-minded, and also where did you find these people in the city? Because at the time, I don't think a lot of folks immediately questioned anything.
no, it was really like an island of lost toys type of group of misfits. We really came from all over the place, and you couldn't ever predict who was going to be, associated with this, affiliated with this. And everybody's responding again out of the collective trauma that the event induced, which it remains unprocessed, I think. and therefore effective as a form of, I guess, manipulation, and as it was intended, I believe. So the people who were drawn to the truth movement were contentious, ornery. They fought a lot with each other. They were passionate.
This was like 2002, 2001, 2003.
Yeah, it was
early 2000s era.
So there was this, you know, there was the anti-war movement that was there, and it was
right. I remember that.
It was going on, and there was some, you know, there was a real energy behind it. And then, but the truth movement was kind of a part of that a little bit, but then ultimately not very welcome in it, I think, because we were more or less dismissed as crazy. And to look at us, you could kind of see why sometimes. And all sorts of, you know, people grabbed onto that theory, no plans and holograms and all sorts of, you know, somebody, I'd been close to it. I knew a lot of people who were close to it. I knew people who saw the planes. I knew various people who saw the planes, you know, crashed into the towers. And I just, you know, and talked to people in the bar that night that, you know, they heard the plane power down like I did the first one as it came in and kind of whistle into the tower. It powered down right after it passed overhead where I was. So for maybe the last mile and a half, it just, you know, so it just whistled in, and then I heard it hit. So we were a really odd, a group of odd ducks.
Wow.
Yeah.
All in the same pond, I believe.
Yeah, and we were listening to these people who were blowing our minds from various perspectives, because these interesting intellectuals came out of the woodwork, and they were saying, well, the way to understand this is you have to, you know, you have to completely reorganize your concept of the way that the world works, especially regarding the nation state, and you have to think more in terms of global alliances and things. And it was a complete reworking of the mental apparatus.
So, you know, but the thing about that is, in my journey, it's also that, but it also was like, of course that's what's happening. So if it wasn't happening, it would, yeah, of course there's a sort of managerial type of class that's managing how we, you know, experience the world and how we experience what possible future of the world there could be.
What's appropriate and what's acceptable and all of that.
Right. And so it really attests to the innocence of human people, right? Like how we can oftentimes be led like sheep away from what is true.
My first impulse when I saw that, I saw from the roof of my building on St. Mark's Place, 1.8 miles north of World Trade Center. I watched the second tower come down, and I knew about 10 seconds, but the first tower had come down, and I didn't see it. I just sat down to watch TV, and we heard these screams from people across the street, and then somebody looked at the television in my neighbor's apartment. I didn't even have a TV at that time. I threw it away when they said that George W. Bush was president of the United States. I said, I'm
done with television.
That's all I need to hear.
Right.
And so, not that whatever gore, but anyway, I ran up to the roof, and there, was only one tower. So I went down and finished making some tea. And then I went back up because I didn't want to miss the second tower falling, which I assumed it would. And then another neighbor was up there, and I remember about 10 seconds before it fell, I knew it was going to fall. I just knew it. And my neighbor and friend, she knew it, and she had her camera raised to take pictures. So we were both we didn't think about why we were anticipating it. And I started yelling down to my friends, like, it's going to fall now. Get up here, get up here. I had a number of friends in that building, and they didn't hear me or whatever. And I just remembered, well, I'm going to just turn and look at it, because it's. So how did I know, like 10 seconds before, that for sure that the tower, exactly when it was going to fall. I just knew like it was impending. So I didn't think about that. And then when I had imagined what it would look like, and I thought it would, because again, I didn't see the first tower. I imagined it would kind of like crimp over and fall, maybe like a drunk falling down or something. I had all these images in my head of how it could possibly go. I thought, like crunch. I just didn't, I had no idea what to expect. And I promised myself, because I said, Tom, you might know people in those buildings. And in any case, these are your neighbors and friends that you're always, I work downtown, within, a few hundred yards of the towers. And I said to myself, you could know these people, you have to witness this, bear witness to what's happening. And whatever you do, don't blink. And I promised myself that I wouldn't blink. And then when I saw the collapse begin, I was so astonished by how it looked, because just, from the sides, just everything started, jutting out almost like 90% perpendicular, just like a cascade or a waterfall. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was just so completely counterintuitive that I broke my promise to myself as it was coming down. Because I thought, am I going crazy? Am I really seeing what I'm seeing? And my friend, she was taking pictures, and you can even see in her series of photographs where she pauses and looks back at me, and I look over at her and I nod to keep going, and she keeps going. But we were both in shock at what it looked like. So she then went down after it had gone down, and she went back into the building, and it's one of these old 5-story walk-ups, and I was up there. I was actually the superintendent of that building at the time. And I was just walking around on the roof going, my God, what did that look like? What did that look like, Tom? What did that look like? What's your first impression? I remember like wanting to record my first impression of it. And I said to myself, it looked like a firework. It looked like a Roman candle. So I knew intuitively that the building had been blown up. That was completely like my thought about it. And yet the cognitive dissonance, the schizophrenia that the event puts us in, oh no, that was just a gravity-driven collapse due to jet fuel and heating up softening the metal. And the first person who later told me, maybe 6 months later, that the towers were blown up, I thought that person, I agreed with them. I was a lie hopper as opposed to a my hopper. I let it happen on purpose for the first year or so. I had to really follow the arguments of, Richard Gage and people like that, the 9/11 Truth Movement, who made the argument for controlled demolition. I actually ended up supplying, my name is in one of the scientific papers as having supplied, the main scientific paper published by the proponents of the controlled demolition hypothesis. And I supplied dust sample that came from, minutes of the North Tower's, destruction. My friend was down there and got caught in the cloud, and he grabbed a handful of dust and he walked up to my place, and he's like, knocks on my door, and he's like, holds this handful of dust. And I thought, well, I might as well keep it as a souvenir, dark souvenirs. I put it in my drawer next to my chunk of the Berlin Wall. And it wasn't until years later that I knew that Richard Gage, and it wasn't Richard Gage, it was the fellow from Stephen. He was the fellow from BYU who had done a lot of work. His last name is I'm not recalling right now. Stephen Jones. Dr. Stephen Jones was looking as part of this international team for one of these dust samples. So I supplied a dust sample, and the material, explosive, a highly advanced thermetic material for the flash melting steel was, the common component of that dust sample, as it was from the other samples that they had collected from that scene. But they needed one from that day, and I supplied that one.
That's like a privilege, but also like such a traumatic thing to sort of witness in a way. It's like a once in a lifetime kind of, it's like, I don't even know what to compare it to really, but um, a lot of folks are traumatized from that. A lot of people in the city suffered from a real case of PTSD
Oh, yeah.
for years after that. And also the sort of that fragmentation of their understanding of what was real and what wasn't real. That also created, I think, a lot of trauma in people. How did you navigate sort of knowing what you know, and still maintaining a grounded way around it for yourself?
I didn't always succeed in remaining grounded, that's for sure. There was a lot of anger. At one point I bicycled down as they kept opening up Lower Manhattan more and more in the weeks and months that followed the event. And when I was finally able to get close enough to the towers I was down where the towers had been, ground zero, as they called it. I remember like looking up toward where all the smoke was still coming. It was a Stygian landscape, even though it was a beautiful day. But if you got anywhere south of where the towers were, it was, a pretty awful place to be, just atmospherically. And
I remember that whole downtown area was just like no bueno. Yeah, it was a hell.
Yeah. So I remember though getting off my bike and saying to the people, the souls of the people, the spirits of the people, I said, who were killed, I said, I would do my best to find out what happened to you, what really happened to you, because I had a deep mistrust in the event. And then I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the MyHop, made it happen on purpose, camp. And I, probably watched images of the towers collapse well over 1,000 times. And then, and listened to all the arguments and pro and con that I could find, and finally just came to the conclusion that it was a highly orchestrated, it was a completely orchestrated event. And then I thought, so I dealt with a lot of anger during that time. I mean, I was very angry person about this, and I was angry at people's reluctance to acknowledge what these very competent and bright and earnest and decent people who were risking their reputations, their jobs, their livelihoods, to say, all of these researchers and these scientists who were going against the mainstream narrative. And then I saw the bad faith in which the other side was arguing. And it struck me that the other side was really, they knew they were lying. And I just intuitively felt from their bad faith responses, not only that they knew they were lying, but that there was something that almost like they were getting off on it. I felt that, like with the fellow.
That gave me like chills to think about that sort of evil. That's like gave me chills to think about that kind of evil in the world in a way. People that are getting off on the fact that they put together a plan and it worked. It's like watching a rocket launch or something. But it's, obviously at the cost of all these lives. So plan worked, but obviously it's, tragedy as a consequence. I'm also curious though, as well, like from what I'm gathering, right, in terms of what you said about kind of honoring the people that passed. I know that you're working on a book right now. Mm-hmm. And I know that you're sort of taking these ideas. I know that you're putting them on paper, or you've already put together that book itself. But I'm also curious if we could break it down, because I know people can go read and deep dive into that book when it's ready for that. But I'm also interested in just creating a really clear synopsis for the listeners, like what happened in your surmising of it, like what the heck was that? And also I'm curious about the symbolism of that as well. Like, what was that?
So when I was dragged kicking and screaming into the Made It Happen on Purpose, or MyHop camp, And I finally went there and allowed myself to feel that outrage, which, penetrated every cell of my body, and was just almost unbearable. But I let myself go there. And then when I finally calmed down, I was driving all my friends crazy, and they said, you have to write something about this. You have to turn your creative energies to this. Otherwise, you're going to drive this all crazy and yourself crazy. So I said, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to see what contribution I can make. Because it became clear to me that the towers were blown up, that these military exercises were intended to obscure the event, even as they were planning for how to make it happen. And there were all these various intelligence agencies, not just from the United States, but from Europe and Israeli intelligence and all these other intelligence agencies, and Saudi intelligence and Pakistani intelligence, that seemed to be involved in the event. Yeah, sure.
It's really I wanted to interject because I'm getting a clearer picture. So you're saying it's a global alliance between all these different sort of world leaders or head of states, which in the media at the time is presented as like as people at odds with each other, but actually they're all sort of in on making one specific event happen, which was 9/11.
Not necessarily heads of states, but intelligence agencies and deep state networks, I would say. So Michael J. Glennon has an excellent book called National Security and Double Government, published by Oxford University Press, if you want to check that out. And he describes how real power is, very clearly describes, no fancy terminology, how basically it's the deep state, or what he calls the Trumanite faction, the national security state, that is the true repository, if you will, of power in the United States, for example. And I think that this is the case in these other countries, that it's these intelligence agencies, these secret intelligence agencies that are, so the governments, in a way, elected governments, et cetera, are in a way a facade, so that the power is really conducted through these networks and at the behest of, well, there are different people who've talked about it. L. Fletcher Prouty, who for almost 10 years was the focal point liaison officer between the Pentagon and CIA, and this during the Vietnam War. He called it a secret team, and he said that it acts at the behest of these very old oligarchical factions that function as a kind of, he said they're actually a very ancient religion. They adhere to a very ancient religion. So my contribution to this, I had the insight, well, if 9/11 really was what I suspect it was, if it was this, deep state operation, if it was, the parapolitical perspective of it, and I'm dealing with that horror and outrage at that, then that would technically make it a human sacrifice. And I thought, well, how long could it take to research the issue of human sacrifice? A couple of weeks, a couple of months tops. And maybe I'll be able to say something germane, that no one else has said about 9/11. And one of the things I realized when I started to research the subject of human sacrifice, blood sacrifice more specifically, is that one of the main symbols of it in not just Western mythology, but Western mythology, certainly Western sacred narrative, is the twins. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And the twins are mythologically, so there's a interplay between myth and ritual that people have noted, scholars have noted, like Fritz Graf, such that while this doesn't always happen, it happens commonly enough to where the pattern is unmistakable. That myth tends to describe ritual, and ritual reenacts the myth. So in so much mythology, you had these twins, and twins had certain characteristics. They were often of extraordinary size. The Kritis were very diminutive, but usually they were very big, like the Aloidae, and they were heavenly, Apollo and Artemis, right? They were the Dioscuri, or Gemini, right? So the Vedic Aspens, there's all of these twin mythologies. It also pervades Native American mythology, First Nations people mythology, and it pervades mythology from all around the world. There's this kind of obsession with twinship, and there's various, reasons for that or whatever that are hypothesized. But so I was like, well, that's very odd. So the twins are of exceptional size, and they're often associated with magical islands, where sometimes they're born on these islands, or they'll grow up on these islands, or they'll die on these islands. And they're associated with fairness in oaths and trade, and they are located at the perceived center of the world, and they're typically associated, oriented like, say, Yachin. I don't know exactly the correct pronunciation of the Yachin and Boaz, the great twin pillars that stood north and south of each other in front of the Temple of Solomon. And then they were, again, always associated with sacrifice, and they were associated with cleansing. They were associated. And so, interestingly, they were also, it seems to be 2 and 3, or the twins and the third, or the triad. Twins, or the dyad, is associated again and again in this in mythology, in these sacred narratives and this sacred symbolism, with a third principle. It's so pervasive that scholars have, made quite a point of it. It's not controversial at all, such that you could say that 2 and 3 seem to be the sacred numbers, the primary sacred numbers of Western tradition, of the Western ritual tradition or sacrificial tradition. So 1, 3, or 3 multiple that is associated with the twins repeatedly, especially in sacrificial scenarios of extraordinary import, sacrificial scenarios marking the change of an age or a dispensation, was the number 3,000 or thereabout. And of course, that's the near precise death toll of 9/11. So twins, giant twins, the twins of exceptional size. Oh, another thing is that the twins tended to be associated with smoke and fire. So, giant twins of exceptional size located on a magical island at the perceived center of the world, that are, act as guardians of oaths and trade, located north and south of each other, and associated with smoke and fire, and that have this number of about 3,000 associated with them, commonly as a death toll. And I found, 6 or 7 instances of this in classical mythology as well as biblical tradition. So it was I thought, well, that's uncanny. There's no way to dismiss these, as detectives are reputed to say, there's no such thing as coincidence. So it became glaringly obvious to me that 9/11 is like a Russian doll. So you take the first part off, that it was a terrorist attack by those enemies, those Islamists who just happened to be sitting on our oil. You take that one off, and you find out it's an inside job, and it's it's done because, for every reason ranging from to make war on those quote unquote enemies, and grab that oil that they have the temerity to be sitting on, to the towers were old and they wanted to get rid of them. Well, you take that one off, and then what I'm saying is in there is that it in fact is ritual, and it's a momentous ritual. And so further research has revealed to me, and this is I'm documenting all this in my book, that the day was absolutely momentous. And I became, the book makes the argument that I don't see how when I look at it this way, I can't avoid the conclusion even though I struggle with believing it myself, that the towers were built for that purpose, and the day that the ground was laid for them, the date of their destruction was preordained. And as crazy as that sounds, I was the last person who ever would have wanted to say such a thing. And it's taken a lot of, I guess, work to attain the mental discipline to endure both the ridicule that saying such a thing incurs, and frankly the hatred that it incurs as well.
So what I'm interested in looking at, along with like just processing all the things you just shared, is this babushka doll. This model, the babushka doll, and what it brings us to is this like ancient religious sort of ritualistic practice that people are participating. Now, you hear about things with the skulls and bones, right? As a part of like, secular culture, living, if you're not a person who reads a lot, you still get like whispers. There's this like meetup, I think, that happens, and I forget exactly where, but apparently it's all based on the elites, and it's essentially a place where people go to have like some tribal type of religious type of endeavor. I don't remember exactly the name. If I cannot,
like Bohemian Grove or something like that.
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. And so you just, again, these things are not like in our face, but like little blips of religious type or ritualistic type of things seem to just like pop up, and then it goes away.
Ritual is the basis of civilization. I mean, philosophy has known this since, Iamblichus, well before that, frankly. Since the origins of philosophy, you can see it in Chinese philosopher Zunzi, who talks about, the fate of the nation lies in ritual, something to that effect. And that ritual is really the greatest and the most austere of subject matters to contemplate. And, woe the person who believes they figured it out. It's the rocket science of the humanities. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say, and it's woefully understudied, and only in the last maybe few decades maybe 2 or 3 decades has ritual studies emerged as an academic discipline. The great Catherine Bell being somebody who condensed a lot of the writing on ritual into 2 really seminal books on the subject. Ritual Theory and Ritual Practice being one of them, and I think the other one is just called Ritual, has a subtitle I don't recall offhand. But ritual is it was central to human cultural evolution. It was almost certainly central to human biological evolution. It is viewed by evolutionary theorists and ritual theorists as being older, predating our species and giving rise to our species. So we're dealing with, the greatest of mysteries in a sense.
I think about ritual, I oftentimes think about the patterns of the sun, right? How we relate to the morning and the evening and the night, and also how we relate to the seasons, and how we relate to the stars and their consistency. And in a way, we're built to that way of being. And that's why religion sort of became a stake in human life. We kind of need something that we can have some sort of ritual in a way to kind of yoke ourselves to, in order to subjugate our darker nature, you could say.
Yeah, it's a massive topic. And what I ultimately have come, what the book argues is that what 9/11 is a symbolic heralding of is the historical close of the Christian dispensation, the end of the Christian dispensation, and a reversion of the West with a capital W to the older, to its pagan roots, if you will, to the old religion of human sacrifice. We essentially have become a people that is so benumbed by spectacle. Our sensibilities have been so degraded, and our cavalier rejection of Christianity has, has this cost. This is the cost. And so we are being used as sacrificial pawns, as sacrificial victims now, because we've stopped observing what we thought we were all, too good to observe and had progressed beyond, because we're so brilliant and we're so much smarter than our stupid ancestors. And really, we've sentenced ourselves to what those ancestors warned us was, lay in store for us if we neglected the observance of ritual, of proper ritual. So this is an enormous violation from it's an eschatological vision that I feel that this book espouses, that I feel that in a sense I've been granted. And it's taken me a long time, and I'm still working on it, to take responsibility for that vision as I feel it deserves, and to articulate it with the care. Here it's over 20 years after, and I'm still working on this book with the care that it deserves. But from the Christian perspective, we're in the age of Antichrist.
And so which I think a lot of Christians across the board would sort of say absolutely to that. But you're presenting a very clear map of that system. And what I'm hearing you say is that 9/11 was really the reset button for this new Antichrist advent, return back to tribalism, return back to the old gods, if you will, return back to human sacrifice. What I'm curious about is my speculation around the subject matter in terms of sacrifice and what happened with 9/11 is I'm looking at things like a book called The Limits of Growth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's Piccolo. I forgot how he's an Italian man, I believe, but he really spearheaded that book. There's been revisions on it later down the line because it was critiqued for being almost too much of it was the eugenicism in it wasn't as hidden, it wasn't as covert. So,
yeah,
there were people really kind of pushed back to it. But The Limits of Growth in many ways targeted African American communities. I won't go into it too much, but it really was about sort of stripping back and taking down the population, starting with the folks that were sort of what they considered to be people that weren't necessarily needed for the future, right? So wanting to get like the optimal human person for the optimal human future, and they speculated lots of different catastrophic events, but this idea of a death cult, which is what I'm kind of hearing to, it harkens back obviously to like the Mayans, and a lot of global tribes have existed in the death cult throughout history. What I'm curious about is this sort of death cult operation that's like undergirding everything. If it's something that's just been happening covertly through governmental powers, and of course you see images of rituals through the presentation of the Freemasons, which could very well also be an artifice, also could just be a way of kind of keeping us placated, while the more sinister elements of rituals are happening in government. But
Freemasons certainly preserve the symbolism, the symbolism of the traditional symbolism of blood ritual. So there's no doubt about that. Whatever else,
right. They have the stabbing of one of their players by another person.
Yeah, and the heart and the
right
at the heart, and I mean, just go on Freemasonic aprons, and Google it, and take your have your fill, and you'll see there's all sorts of Jachin and Boaz, J and B, north and south, sun and moon and altar right between the three candles, and and the checkerboard floor and the 3 steps up to it. It's just, it's very standard stuff. Wow. And drawn from biblical as well as classical mythology. There's not, a metaphysical source I found very helpful is René Guénon on this subject, and he, the French metaphysician and sage, and who writes from what he characterizes as a traditional metaphysical perspective, not an arbitrary one, but one that's informed from his Sufism by a great respect for the 5, great faiths, the major faiths, as well as, his buddy, his friend, Fridtjof Schuon was also initiated into, First Nations peoples here of this continent, a couple of their traditions. So he's very well informed, but in his book, Symbols of the Sacred Science, he says, it's a metaphysical teaching that this dark cult has been around for, since time immemorial. I think to a degree they have been held at bay by a population that was imbued with the morality of Christianity, but that has receded. Obviously, again, we feel we're much too sophisticated for that, and so it's led to the reemergence of this cult and into predominance over this at the historical level.
So there's a Bible verse that always sticks out when I think about this sort of death cult that comes to my mind, and it's in Genesis, and I think it's Genesis anyway. Who am I to say? I'm not like a Bible scholar here completely, but the wages of sin is death, right? I think it's New Testament. Yeah, New Testament. The wages of sin is death, and the gift of Christ is eternal life. But it really talks about the sort of
that sums it up, right?
of our experience as humans, which is this cost for the fall, which is death. And I think a lot of other tribes around the world have kind of recognized that system is in place in a very real way. Mm-hmm. And the idea of human sacrifice is a part of that system because it's a requirement for their civilization to sort of have any kind of chance against the nature of being, in a way, at the time.
Part of my book, is that I agree with Bruno Latour, who wrote the book, We Were Never Modern. And I compare, Western culture and society in its present form to Amazonian tribes and peoples who recognize that they're governed by a system of, they're more advanced than us in the sense of recognizing that they're governed by a human sacrificial system. We are, too obstinate to recognize this. I don't think what I'm arguing is all that. I don't think it's controversial at all from a traditional metaphysical perspective. From that perspective, it now strikes me as, entirely obvious and incontrovertible, in fact. So it's only, shocking to this postmodern, gaga goo goo mind malaise that most of us are caught in, so many of us are caught in because, well, we'd rather have a good time than think about things like this. And I understand that. I'm not speaking as a saint here by any means. So. Well,
and nor am I. And what it does do is give deep credence to the idea of Christ's sacrifice. And again, this is not to put in purpose any kind of religious dispensation or understanding around Christianity, but rather just looking at reality of how things are, looking at the nature of things from a more ontological perspective. It gives real rise to the nature of Christ, and also the need for the sacrifice of Christ, or some ultimate sacrifice of human. So, or some ultimate human sacrifice. So my thing is looking at 9/11 as a sort of a part of this tradition of human sacrifice. And this particular human sacrifice, because what I'm hearing you say is this is created with an intention, right? It's each sacrificial experience isn't just, being offered up to the gods. It's a clearing and an intention that allows for a new thing to come, right? A new sort of cleansing and renewal to come through the deaths of all these thousands of people. And of course, now we're living in this era, having experienced COVID, now with AI and a few other things that are on the horizon. We are really seeing humanity tilt towards something that we really have never, speculated it could go so crazy so quickly. But it seems as though people like yourself have had some foresight to this in a way, right? So you've got, we just came out of a pandemic. The pandemic has been, clearly aligned with people like Bill Gates and other folks that are in a very moneyed space in the world, a very prestigious category of people in the world, have had high stakes in this pandemic, and they've been very open about it.
Yeah. And their associations with Jeffrey Epstein have been very open as well.
That too, right?
They don't seem to flinch about that really that much, right? Well, he's dead now, I think, as Gates said, smiling.
But the thing for me is, I think we as public, we get the media is very tricky because a slither of truth will pour through, because we're on the immediate public. We're getting through TV and even on social media, we're getting the last drop of what is really happening. It's like playing telephone, and you're like the last person in a 20-person line once it hits the news to actually hear what took place or what's really going on, right? So it's hard to really, and at that point, there can be deep manipulation about how things are presented, how they're categorized, and how they are seen. I certainly learned that with Trump's presidency, for example, not to launch into him because he's a whole other topic as well. And whatever you want to say about the man, what you can see is that the media did have a very clear allegiance and intention to create false narratives about him. Now, granted, he might have did and have done horrible things, but in reality, the narratives they were creating got so grandiose that you couldn't deny the fact that they were creating something out of thin air often when it regards to him. So I'm not saying Trump's off the island with Epstein either, right? But I am saying that there's a very powerful thing that's happening with media right now, particularly, and I feel that the media is aligned in many ways with this ritual, right? With these events that are happening, maybe not the faces that you're seeing, but the sort of hand up the puppet, right?
These are not journalists. I really feel that in a way we're being governed at almost all aspects, worldly aspects, temporal aspects. We're being governed by, narcissists. I mean, people who are clinical cluster B personalities. And it's pathological. So we're in a pathocracy, and it all makes sense. It's all, again, of a holistic piece with what I'm describing, right? So we're lied to as a matter of course by people who view themselves as inherently, superior to us, even as a kind of superior species. And there's going to be no bargaining with such people. all we can do, I think, is separate ourselves and do the best we can to reclaim our souls, to heal our souls. And I think that that's the most effective thing that we can do, is to concentrate first and foremost on that at each of us at an individual level. And because we're just going to get chewed up out there if we're don't think we're going to have a protest against it or whatever. Not that I dismiss political efforts to deal with it. I mean, I'm encouraged by certain things like the.
But it does seem at this point like taking a spoon to the ocean and trying to bail the water out, right? It's sort of a little too late, too much.
You know, one of the things that I'm kind of maybe the most sobering aspects of what I'm talking about in the book about 9/11 is that, and in a way, not only how 9/11 functions, but how even a book like mine might function, or even this interview might function, is that there is a ancient precept, sacrificial precept, that was termed by Carl Muley the comedy of innocence. And it's the principle according to which the victim of a sacrifice must be seen to go willingly to, or even to partake in, its own sacrifice. So I think that there's a reason that these sacrifices are done in this way, that they are interpretable. They're, in a way, the signature of ritual is right on them, and it becomes unmistakable. So they leave a kind of telltale mark of what they're doing, right? And what this functions to do is to fulfill the comedy of innocence. They've warned us. They warned us with 9/11 what they were doing. It's quite obvious, I think, that, you know, we've seen a repeat of it with COVID. So you could look at 9/11 as you know, a mark on this kind of parapolitical progression. You know, the coup of '63, the assassination of Kennedy, the assassinations of Robert Kennedy, the assassinations of the civil rights leaders, you know, MLK, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, on down the line, right? Medgar Evers, you know, and then the crack cocaine epidemic, and, you know, the CIA importing all of that, and the Murrow building. They attacked the left and they attacked the right. That's what, you know, again, the twins, you know, were so divided. So Ruby Ridge, Waco, you know, and the left's all like, yeah, get them, you know. Well, but then, you know, they're also attacking the left at the same time in these hideous ways, you know. And so building then to, I think, you know, a practice run for 9/11 was something like the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. And then, you know, so then boom, 9/11, and then there are these lulls, and then boom, COVID. So this like a drug addict, you know, since our sensibilities are so benumbed, you know, we're going to keep requiring a bigger and bigger hit for these things to be effective. And that's even as we're being told that this is what's happening to us. And look, you don't do anything about it, so why shouldn't we do this to you? You are like stupid cattle. You sit there and you take it. We tell you in the oldest language that there is, we tell you in the ancient language of symbolism, that's the basis of your civilization, of your Bible, of Greek mythology, of Western mythology. We're showing you exactly what we're doing. And you do nothing about it because you're too arrogant to believe what your ancestors told you never to forget. You know, so I'm reminded that again, it's a metaphysical precept that when we point out the corruption of leaders of the global power elite, the worldly elite, we have to realize that in some sense, it is a reflection, a mimetic image, mirror image of the demotic or mass corruption of our own tendencies toward injustice and evil and decadence and viciousness and violence. In fact, when you read political theory from Machiavelli through Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss, as much as I've battled with those guys, this is very clearly stated. That the first principle that anybody who wishes to found a state must contend with is the evil of human beings, is that human beings are evil, and that this is the predominant characteristic of human beings. And this requires, on the part of the sovereign prince, or the figure of sovereignty in the republic. I mean, Machiavelli is talking about both. That they must partake at the same time in evil in order to manage an evil. And this is why, the mystery goes back to the great mystery of the biblical founder of civilization is Cain, the murderer of his brother, the first child ever born, who murders the second child ever born, and then founds civilization. And so this is a figure that's common in myth. Romulus is another such figure. The founder of Rome is the murderer of his own twin. The Bible suggests, through the way that it's worded, that Cain and Abel are twins, and that they seem to come, in the way the Bible's worded, from the same conception. 3 kids, Seth being the third, from 2 conceptions, again with 3s and with 2s. So there is actually a tradition, Jewish oral tradition. Cain and Abel were viewed as twins, so it's not a ridiculous suggestion. And in any case, in that story, what do we see both of them doing? They're mirroring each other in both. It's conducting a ritual in what is the Bible's first instance of a ritual. In the first instance of a ritual, someone is murdered, a brother, a twin, somebody from the in-group of the founder of civilization, who ends up being the founder of civilization. So again, these are the oldest, most famous stories that we, in our culture, that we have access to. And they're going to be the ones that, should human beings survive, will survive us, because only a few stories can survive. And these have proven to be the most durable. So I don't want to just sit here and go, oh, icky, look at how terrible our leaders are. This is really ultimately a critique of our culture more broadly, and an acknowledgement, I hope, if it's anything, of our own complicity in the system of Antichrist.
Which is ultimately a death cult.
Yes. A human sacrificial cult. And I mean a ritual human sacrificial cult in the most literal possible sense of that phrase.
Antichrist would be the high priest of that.
Yes.
I didn't consider it that way, but it's a perfect symbol for what his duty would be, right? We sort of hear the word Antichrist, and I think in
heads of states have been traditionally thought of as priests,
right,
as the high priest of the state.
Right, and so sort of hearing you frame it that way, it gives meaning and context to that idea of what Antichrist is. And my mind goes to Fauci. I'm like, he's yeah.
Well, he's on a candle. He's on a lot of candles from a lot of very dutiful, people who are convinced of their own superiority to the rest of us, if they're convinced of anything.
Well, and yes, that much he is, and he's not abashed about any of that. But COVID happened, and my dad was an elderly person at the time, and he was very sort of on the fritz with his health, and the hospitals closed down.
Yeah.
Right, and so we're watching people on the news getting all this stuff they're showing you to terrify you, right? So he starts getting a little sick, and I'm there taking care of him, helping him through all of that stuff. He ends up passing away because the hospitals were closed down. And now, I'm not saying that's unique to me. What's more interesting is the fact that it's not unique to me, right? That so many people died not of COVID, but rather because hospitals had closed down and they couldn't get the proper medical care. Now, what's interesting in my case, and I don't think it's unique to me in this way either, is that he was immediately assigned COVID as his the thing that ultimately, you know, cost him his life without any testing, without any sort of investigation in him at all. They just immediately, I called the hospital and I was like, I mean, this is happening. Very viscerally, I was like, you know, can we, you know, how do you know? And they were just like, well, we're just going to go ahead and put him down as that anyway, because that's probably what it is. And I felt so powerless at the time, right? Because this is like mid 2020 or something. So it was like right in the middle of it all. Felt so powerless in the front of what they were doing to people. And so you realize that at any time they can shut down the hospitals. They can, you know, nursing homes can also get put in position where elderly people are easily wiped out. So you can see their power in some ways, right? They can wipe out a huge part of the population like that.
The whole thing was a beta test. I'm very sorry to hear about that. And
Yeah,
the whole thing was a beta test at one level of you know, establishing the mechanisms of social control that will allow them to do anything from, you know, closing our bank accounts if we step out of line or say or the wrong thing, to isolating us to small enclaves, you know, that they can control by telling us, oh, there's an outbreak in the other conclave, and trying to control us all through our, you know, again, social credit scores and you know, anybody who doesn't see this all as happening is probably not worth talking to at this point, unless they're, you know, unless they have the ability to see it. But I really do think we're at that stage where we need to cut off, out of compassion for ourselves and those other people, frankly, anybody who cannot see what's going on, that there is an extraordinary degree of intentionality to at least think from that perspective of there being an a level of intentionality that's thoroughgoing behind things like 9/11, COVID, and the censorship, the social credit scores, the technocracy, the surveillance that's all flowing from that, the controlling of our economy. You know, this is a pitched battle, and the forces of human liberty and decency are losing, and losing badly. And I don't think we can afford to kid ourselves if we align ourselves with those forces, because the rest is just an orgy. It's just people who want to live in a drug and sex orgy to whatever degree. And look, you know, I can understand that desire. I've experienced that desire. I still experience that desire. But I'm doing my best to resist it, because that's what's taking us down. And we're going down. I don't know that there's any getting out of it at this point. I don't see a political solution. I'm encouraged by people who are willing to throw their, you know, bodies on the meat grinder. I think RFK Jr. is willing to do that, and power to him. I deeply respect what he's doing, and, you know, I'll support him as far as I feel I can.
he needs the support right now, because it's like,
yeah.
you know, they give you the tin hat category, and, you know, it's still happening where they put the tin hat on you, and then all of a sudden they silence you, right? You're a conspiracy theorist, you're a racist, you are whatever it is. You know, it just means we don't want to hear you speak.
And from the idea of, you know, of systemic racism and things like that, that the left has so aligned itself with these globalist forces, you know, where the liberals have so aligned themselves, unquestioningly aligned themselves with these globalist forces that are centered in what I don't know how anybody could fail to see as the oldest form of white supremacy on the planet. I mean, the WEF, Davos, the royal family. I mean, sure, there may have been some tokenism at the coronation, but are we kidding ourselves? These are the people who are going to control the oligarchical collectivism that we're being herded into. And, at a pace that I would have thought impossible, in the beginning of 2019. And now it's looking inevitable. And it is not going to be a nice world. It's going to be a hideous, it's going to be a world of deprivation and unfreedom, of captivity, of neo-feudal serfdom, where human depth will basically be non-existent. And the only people with any depth of character will live quite fearful and oppressed existences. And I think that's what we're heading toward in the near term. I hope not.
Well, I mean, we're there now in some ways. I think you can see it just with how popular culture. I think about Black culture to some element, and Black culture was a culture that gave us jazz and gave us some incredible literature, and this is through like Jim Crow era, even the art that boomed out of the culture, as well as just the sense of decadence and beauty that was bestowed into like the Black communities. And these are people with very little money, but they still dressed incredibly well. They were still having their time on Sunday at church and continuing with family tradition in a very sentimental way, regardless of the fact that there was quote unquote white supremacy among them, which at the time was valid because there were incidences of different things happening. Far less now. But I look at where the culture is in terms of musicality and even fashion and how it's being presented. And it's just so sad. It's like, wow, it's all gotten so watered down and so reductive. And in a way, it's gotten offensive.
And overtly satanic in many cases.
And overtly satanic. Which brings me to the question of mimesis, and also how the basis of Girardian ideology connects to a large portion of what you're talking about in terms of how culture is cohorted. I think René Girard is really great in a sense that he really kind of carved out a way for us to see modernity in a religious context without sort of being so much in the religious air that we can't really grasp it if we're not tapped into religion. I think anybody who studies Girard can get that.
He revealed the anthropology of Christianity.
Right. That part, exactly. He really did. He really did. And I think Girard also, in his processes, really showed very clear evidence of this sort of cult of sacrifice. And this pattern that's consistently
that it's ultimately again the twins and the Masons, right? It's the twins are such symbols are kind of they don't mean one thing, right? The literature acknowledges that they're overcharged with an abundance of meaning. They're supercharged with meaning, if you will, and I keep coming back to that image of the twins, and that it's emblazoned through.
Well, I think Romulus and Remus as well too. Those two characters,
Romulus and Remus.
You're right. Yeah, think of that as well.
Yeah. Yes. And again, the echo of that with Cain and Abel. So right. You mentioned something about like Black culture, and I think of that. And I think it's relevant to our culture overall, since we're entering what I think is really a kind of period of neo-slavery. And in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, there's a famous passage where he talks about how between Christmas and New Year's, the slaves would be given a holiday, and they could drink all they want, and party all they want, and do whatever they want. They didn't have to do any work. And a small minority of people who were enslaved would not do any of that. They wouldn't participate in the party. They would tend to their own affairs. They would tidy up the house. They would do repairs on their homes. They would take care of business, right? They were earnest and applied themselves to their own, working on their own lives and well-being in that period of time. And he said, you always knew that was the person who was not a slave. I'm paraphrasing, but that was the person who was not a slave in their mind. That was not really a slave. And St. Augustine said this, right? That a slave can be free and a king can be a slave, right? If the slave has mastered his passions, then he is more free than the king who is not. And these men and women who could do this, but they were a minority of people. They were a minority of people. The rest of the slaves just partied so hard and got so drunk that they ended up realizing, oh well, we're just what the master says we are, and we'll never be able to handle freedom. And they were so hungover by the time they got out of it that they were glad to go back to work again. And I think that that's going to be the majority of our culture, that we're heading into this servitude, and most people may never know that they're slaves. I mean, I do think there will come a point where the velvet glove will come off the iron fist.
Well, it's also, the slaves are also the sacrificial class, right? They're the ones that they find the most sort of fit and healthy and beautiful. But it was often a slave daughter or a woman who was brought up like a pure virgin. And I think in so many ways, the African American community, the left has often said like, oh, the America was built in a black people, and oftentimes it's this kind of I won't go into too much, but it's kind of cargo cult where you take from the culture of something that's more predominant and you assign it to yourself and then you run with it. But I think when I really look at it, I think what they're wanting to really look at is that the Black American population today, maybe it didn't start that way, but it certainly is a sacrificial lamb in America, right? It's the community in which a lot of the abortions are happening. There's immense crime in these communities. And so there's a lot of death in the Black American community. And if you live among that community, which is why nobody wants to, you get impacted by that reality of people getting shot or hurt. There's like a meme on Twitter. It says, Black men deserve to die old. And it's like, wow, the fact that you even have to say that, right? And so I think in many ways, I think that's very constructed as well. I think it's purposeful. I think the state has created a real way of making sure that population is limited as much as possible. So it's like we're getting hit, you're right, from both left and right. What I seem to think though is that the culture at large on the right is a little bit more perceptive when it comes to these things. I think the culture on the right also can have a level of arrogance as well around their leaders and their politics. But for the most part, they're not going to toss you out if you're conspiratorial. Right. They will lend an ear, and in many ways, they might echo back what you're saying. Whereas in the left, they think in a way, they are the most innocent. They're certainly more innocent than folks on the right that kind of understand to somewhat degree that something's off. The left, however, seems to be incredibly innocent. In a way pure, because they don't see the conspiracy. They often might have an idea of something happening, but they really believe in their heart that they're doing the right thing. Yeah. So we look at this ideal pattern for sacrifice, which is often along the lines of the sacrifice of the virgin or the innocent, and you can see how there seems to be sort of I would almost say shepherding of the innocent into this sort of cult of sacrifice, cult of human sacrifice. And I brought up Girard because I think in many ways Girard gives credence to that understanding. He really kind of like allows that understanding to happen in an academic framework, and not just a religious one, but you can see the pattern of the scapegoat, the sacrifice, the innocence, and then obviously like the beginning of a new God as a result.
You know, Girard, I think, is just the indispensable voice philosophically of our moment. He said so many wise things and so clearly, especially for a French intellectual. It's kind of shocking. People were put off by him, and he even expressed regret about this, that because he made more of his Catholicism, I think, than which wasn't a lot. I mean, but I think he would have, if he had to do it over again, I think he would have really not made anything of it, because I think he was so rejected reactionarily as on that basis that people couldn't really see. A lot of people couldn't see the value of what he was doing, even as the people first did. And I think more and more people are seeing the value of it. But he said he's key. How the left, the extremes of the left and the right are creating each other right now. And what the left does not the left thinks the more hysterical I get, the more the right is just going to have to step in line. And they don't realize that that's not how it happens. And Girard, the warning from Girard, and this was of course understood by Dr. King, for example, who, in saying that we have to be peaceful. This has to be non-violent, because if we engage in violence, we're going to get in a mimetic battle with the right, or with the forces, not just the right, but the forces, of oppression and of racism and bigotry. And we don't want to get in a mimetic battle with them. We want to set a higher moral bar. Now, I understand there's other things that Dr. King said about, riots being, the voice of the oppressed and things like that too. It's not just cut and dry. But on the main method that he promoted was, nonviolent resistance and that kind of civil disobedience on the Thoreau model. So he understood what Girard understood. What the right is what the left is creating through its antics and through its, frankly, through its decadence. I mean, so many of the young people on the right, or on the left especially, they can't see that you're acting like privileged brats, and you're creating this response to you, this that's building on this frustration on the part of the right. You're creating the very thing you claim to be against through your embrace of potentially, punch a fascist. And who's a fascist? Well, anybody who disagrees with me, or anybody who might have a contrary opinion about allowing children to begin, to go on puberty blockers. Is that a fascist? Is somebody who's got qualms about that? So they're creating this backlash against them in how they're acting out in their embrace of violent protest. And again, it's not a good sign of the times.
It really lines up with the idea, as what kind of going to earlier, the idea of innocence. And that's what Christ said on the cross, right? Which is, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do.
It's almost like there's a death wish playing out, and I wonder if there isn't at some level a collective death wish. Maybe Freud was onto something about that. It does feel to me like there's a collective death wish playing out. I just heard anecdotally so many people who are just, and I even can sense it in myself in my grimmer moments, but I think people are just fed up with it. I think we're getting to that point where we've fallen away from any generation that has actually ever known war. The World War II generation was the last one that really knew war in a kind of mass scale. Now you had the Vietnam War vets, Korean and Vietnam War vets, but that was more limited. That wasn't, a national, mobilization. But even those people are getting older. And so you're having the emergence of a generation that's never known war and that is behaving like, well, it's not going to be, that it's not going to be that big of a deal. And I think just a lot of out of frustration, despair.
In particular, the men, I think, as well. I mean, that's sort of something that I like to talk about on the channel. It's just how this sort of secular culture is affecting men. And I think men really are the sort of pillars of our culture in many ways. We're meant to really sort of be the backbone. And so if we start to waver in our convictions about ourselves, our own self-esteem starts to fall apart, then it's really, then it becomes kind of a train wreck. I think, the metaphysics in terms of like how we interpret reality is a big part of what keeps us healthy. And rituals in our life, religious rituals, I think are a big part of what keeps us healthy. I was saying to a friend who, she said that she was, very religious growing up and left religion because she thought she wanted to become more spiritual. And I said, well, listen, you can try whatever religion you want, but get in one, because the spiritual is really the jungle, and you don't know what the heck is out there. There's no pattern. Ideally, find a religious pattern that yields the best fruit, which I do believe, just as a subsequence of like what society has given us through Catholicism and Christianity. I think it lands in that category. I think Buddhism also has some credence as well. Anything that sort of has the element of logos pattern within it often gives a boom to culture. So
the reason it actually becomes religion properly so called is because it is a boon to culture.
Right. It allows culture to flourish. Mm-hmm. And when we remove that, it's like we're moving into the jungle. We're moving back into the tribal way. And, in some ways, the tribal way had a better stance because they were pagans, and pagans had a strategy around patterns. Currently, we're in a place where it's a takeover. The patterns are gone. We have no clue what to do, and deep state governments are implementing new religious patterns. Right? You've got the LGBT pride. It started like a day. It started
sacrificial pattern too.
Right. It used to be LGBT Parade Day, then it became Parade Week. Now we have LGBT Month. Right. So that's patterned in. Then you have like Black History.
So I'm thinking, with everything that's going on, it reminds me of two things, both in the one of the Republic and the other in that's biblical, the Book of Revelation. In the Book of Revelation, people talk a lot about toxic masculinity. They don't talk as much about toxic femininity. And I think we really are in an age of the toxic feminine. And we're in an age of the smothering mother. There's that movie out, 3 hours of one of the strangest movies you'll ever see, but I think it's really about this. Beau is Afraid, which I saw, and I actually feel it's really worth seeing, even though it's not necessarily a pleasant movie to watch. But I think it's about the age we're living in. It's about the toxic feminine. It's about the smothering mother, and I do think that's part of what we're in. We're not letting our kids grow up. Our kids want safety above all, which is why they're all so easily triggered, and which is why so many of them are on drugs, drug after drug after drug, to make them feel better and to give them surgery so they can feel like themselves, and permanent medical interventions so they can feel like themselves because they're born into the wrong bodies. Now, God bless you if you're in that situation. I'm not, I've been through my own history and changes and rebellions and everything. So I'm not speaking, I believe it or not, I'm trying to speak to you from a place of love and compassion in what I'm saying. And I wouldn't be saying any of this if I didn't have that intention behind it. But the biblical reference that I think applies here is that in the end times, the toxic feminine and the toxic masculine are symbolized by the whore and the beast. And there is a kind of reign of the whore, the great whore. And she rides in on the beast. The whore is the toxic feminine. The beast is the toxic masculine. Now, there is a toxic masculine, and there has been toxic masculinity, no doubt, in our culture, right? So it has been difficult and unnecessarily difficult for women in many ways. I don't doubt any of this. But what we entered into in this is a culture which has had a devastating and crippling effect on our youth. A culture of helicopter parenting, a culture of smothering them and of catering to their every whim, to the point at which we are now mutilating them and medicalizing them for life, and saying that the detransitioners don't matter, even though there's more and more of them emerging. Oh, well, there's not that many. Really? I seem to be finding quite a few.
A lot, and there's a lot of them on Twitter, and it's and more and more. And
there will be more. And so, look, it's just a matter of people growing up and realizing, like you and I realized, man, I did some things in my youth that I really regret. I really did some stupid things in my youth, and I had some ideas in my youth
that were very
wrong.
Shamefully stupid ideas.
I'm glad I didn't follow through on more of them than I did, and I regret following through on a lot of them. You know?
So true. So, I mean, it does humble you, doesn't it? In a way, it sort of makes you think. It makes you have a level of humility around your mind to realize your mind is not a friend. Don't always trust it.
No, right.
It doesn't really know what it's doing.
And as Ecclesiastes says, the heart is deceitful above all things.
That part as well. So
the mind and the heart, you got to watch it. So,
so true.
So the whore rides in on the beast. So the worst of the feminine rides in on the worst of the masculine. The worst of the feminine rides in on toxic masculinity. And she's a nasty whore. And she's a deceiver. And I don't mean, this is not a denigration of sex workers or anything like that. This is a whore in spirit. Right? This is taking it to the nth degree, right? And that is not somebody you want to be around. But how does she ride in? She rides in on the back of the toxic masculine, on the beast. And what ends up happening is the beast, what does he do? He unites the 10, I don't remember the symbolism exactly, the 10 torches or something, the 10 flames or the 10, I forget. But he ends up attacking the whore. The whore will act out into such a way that will cause such a violent and ugly revulsion in the toxic masculine that the toxic masculine will attack and kill the whore. So I think these are just archetypal, at one level, these are just archetypal maps for these tectonic movements in human civilization or human, sociality. And I very much am concerned that there will be that there could and be an extremely toxic, again, quote unquote, symbolically masculine response to what we're seeing going on today with this, what feels very often like a childish fit that the identity politics left is shoving down our throats these days, to the glee and with the entire backing of the globalist, forces that are the ultimate white supremacy. and that will be the rulers, that will install the Antichrist, that will guide and reign over this period that we're living in, over the pit. If you look up in the book of Revelation, chapter 9, verse 11, 9/11, the God that will rule over them in the bottomless pit is Apollon, is Apollo, a twin, right? And Apollo is is the pagan god of civilization. And he's also a god of death. He's the god that brings death, and he's the archer. He shoots and kills from afar. And that's who we've made our God in this time. The God that kills from afar. He can kill us without our even seeing it. And this is the God that rules over us in this bottomless pit that we are in. And the more that we behave in this way, and again, it goes back to the Republic. Plato says, to Socrates, Socrates say, the reason that democracy fails is because everybody goes off doing their own thing. And then even to the extent that animals are treated as the equals of humans, and we're getting to that extent. We're seeing apologias for bestiality. We're seeing people who want to marry their pets. We're seeing people who think they are animals, who identify as animals. We're seeing litter boxes being brought into schools. We're going in this direction. And it will give rise to what I fear is coming. If we don't go into a total, we're going to go into one tyranny or another. But and I don't know, they're all equally as horrid. But the tyranny that we could well go into is the tyranny of the toxic masculine that Plato describes. Because people will become so freaked out because they're seeing that when everybody goes in their own way, culture cannot survive, civilization cannot survive. And that survival instinct will kick back in, and those denial mechanisms that had everybody claiming 9/11 was exactly what the media told us it was, the military industrial complex owned media, being part of that, an essential part of that complex,
Right.
Well, that powerful state of denial will do whatever it takes to survive. Just, again, people have characterized this age as Weimar. I think that's an apt characterization.
I mean, it feels as though a lot of these things are really subsequentially happening as a result of World War II in particular, to how modernity is unfolding in our current zeitgeist. It seems that right after that war is when we started to really see things kind of boom, right? The baby boomers. And later down the line, the Gen Xers came, and the Gen Xers are really the ones that raised, right? The people of the 90s really raised the kids you're seeing that are currently confused, and something like crazy percentages of these kids identify as queer or gay or somewhere on a spectrum of just several levels of mental illness. And it's sad. It's extremely sad. And so I want to kind of, bring a bookend to this talk as well. So to bring a certain kind of hope. But first I want to plug my phone in because it's about to die. Give me 1 second. Yeah, so I'm just, I'm curious about hope and redemption, because I think we've heard these Christian and Catholic preachers that were preaching hell and brimstone for years, right? And people ran from the Catholic Church, ran from Protestant churches as well, but that spoke about hell and brimstone. And I think what we're basically telling people right now is hell and brimstone. Right. And but
it's unavoidable.
right, but it is a way, you do want to warn people with love, right? I don't think it's loving to allow people to do things that will hurt them and simply watch idly. I don't think that's loving. Maybe they'll be more peaceful, but I don't know if they'll necessarily live longer. You know, so I think great power in admonishing people just where we are and what is happening, our location and time, and also the consequences of our actions and where things are right now in terms of like where culture is going. And so I want to sort of find hope in this, and I think a part of it harkens to religion for me. And you revisited the Catholic Church recently. Um, I remember we had conversations around that, and also have found a way of healing through your faith practice with the Catholic Church. For people that are out there, I want to kind of, ask you personally, like how that took place, and because I think without for you to have all the things that are in your mind and also in your frame of reference from 9/11, all these different things are very traumatic things. And then the information itself is traumatizing. And I think if you were like a Gen Z, kid, you'd probably be in a blanket somewhere, like freaking out,
Yeah.
but you found a way of healing and peace, even with the knowledge of what's happening, which I think a lot of folks traditionally have in Catholicism as well. They say hell and brimstone, but they actually have peace.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah. I
how
think
did you? What's that?
yeah, I think I have a sense of what you're getting at.
Right,
How do we have a sense of peace
right,
in,
right,
in the midst of the apocalypse?
right.
And I think that's really, I think that in a way that's the ultimate question, because we have in Islamic tradition, there's a saying that even if you know the hour of the world is to end, remain at your plow. And then I also think of so we have to keep doing what we do. And I also think of a Taoist principle that what is the good man but the bad man's teacher? What is the bad man but the good man's job? If you forget this, you will be lost no matter how intelligent you are. It is the great secret. So that engaging this dark stuff is simply the work that we're to be doing. And of course, in the Christian tradition, it's expressed in the words of Jesus, behold, I send you forth as sheep in the midst of wolves, be therefore as wise as serpents and as harmless as doves. And I think Socrates says in Plato that the purpose of philosophy is to teach us how to die. And ultimately, that's the greatest fear. That's the ultimate fear. And so Catholicism, for all my battles with it, and I believe I know the battles with it. I know them from often bitter personal experience, and I've felt myself to be, opposed to the church at times, and at times radically opposed to it. So my returning to it was not something I took lightly, and my faith is still, a challenge. It's still a struggle. But one thing that it calls me to a consciousness of, above all things, is forgiveness, and my own need for it in my life, and how, recently it's become clearer than ever to me that the only reason that any of us are here is through the sacrifice of Christ, in that it does inculcate a revolutionary experience of forgiveness, that we aren't responsible for all the things that in the ancient world could have and often would have gotten us killed, and for all of the mimetic vengeance and violence that will ultimately destroy our society and threatens to destroy our society. When we realize that we don't have to follow through with that somebody already paid that price, and that all what's asked from us in return is to do the best we can and to practice that forgiveness, to forgive others their trespasses or their debts as we, as we're forgiven. And then I think that's the fundamental reality of it. And it's such, it took me to the, age of 58 to begin to come to terms with how profound that reality is and how much of a sinner really I am. And how impure my motives for how I act or want to act very often have been and are, and how carnal and how at times cruel and animalistic. And so the only means I have of rising above that, I mean, I really do feel that religion has charted a course out of that kind of behavior. And even though, of course, I remain imperfect. And so I would say that it's reacquainted me with the essence of the religion, which is forgiveness, and acting in some way that transcends my lust, that transcends my greed, that transcends my hatred and my anger, and all of the 7 deadly sins, my pride, and my sloth, and my arrogance, and all those things that from within the practice of my faith I'm acutely and often painfully aware of in myself, and aware of in myself first and foremost of the log in my own eye, as opposed to the mote in the eye of others, which is why I speak compassionately to those people who would disagree with me. I'm not speaking from a place. You don't get to be 58, without really having screwed up, in life and done some things you deeply regret, and wanting to just impart whatever you can to the younger people to spare them just some fraction of that pain.
The suffering, right?
And the suffering, which, I don't even know if it's possible to, but I hope it is. And I think that it might be. And, so again, it's been a restoration of sanity. And for me, it's been a process of healing. The phrase that makes the most sense is the healing of the soul. It's helping me to heal my soul, which has been so ravaged by a society that revels in the 7 deadly sins. So
It's incredible, actually, in so many ways. The Catholic faith and the Christian tradition, and its, I could say, like more original format, is what's being used in systems like AA, cognitive behavioral therapy. So, the realities of what these sort of systems of value and aspects of virtue create in human life has been scientifically proven and also cultivated to sort of repattern themselves in non-religious ways. But the Catholic Church really has not just the faith, but also a real clear structure around how we can deal with our mental health.
yes.
And to actually heal. In the Orthodox Church as well, the Christian Orthodox faith also has a very powerful cognitive healing. They call it the purification of the nous, which is really our mind, right? Purifying our mind from the illusion or the suffering of reality, right?
Yeah.
And it's also what we witness with our eyes that needs to be purified. That event that can be traumatic has to be purified in our mind's eye as well. Whether it's like fights or disagreements you have with folks, all these things imprint our body and our lives and needs purification. And without that, I think there is an incredible buildup, and eventually people start to fantasize about death because there's no way of purifying. You know, that the money doesn't do it, right? You can't purify with wealth. You can't purify with relationships. You really can't purify your mind in any other way but some kind of spiritual advent that ideally is in the structural religious pattern. So discovering that, I think, is huge.
You know, there's a coalescing of the wisdom of the ages. It's an ancient wisdom. It's the wisdom of ancestors, of many ancestors, and it's multicultural, right? It's not just white people. You know, it's a multicultural. It's, you realize that the symbolic and ritual language that the church is drawing from, that it practices, is so profound and so ancient. It's older than the church. It goes back into the Old Testament, and it goes back into prehistory, and it opens up that sense of communion with these ancestors. And I think a lot of the people who look, you know, I've been there. I've been on the side, people who hate the church. I've been there. I understand it. I bitterly fought the church, and I felt that the church was, you know, an agent of hatred and an agent of bigotry. So I understand that, but ultimately I've just come to a different place in my life. And you know, Girard makes a point, and the profundity of it, it seems like such an easy thing to dismiss, but again, as I've been like kind of on my walks out here, you know, visiting my family, it just strikes me so hard, again, the profundity of this insight. And Girard says something to the effect of, you know, people often talk about all of the violence caused in the name of religion. What they don't talk about is the violence that religion has prevented.
Say that one more time. That's a great quote from Girard.
Yeah. So people often talk about the violence of religion, right? But what they neglect is the violence that religion has prevented. And I know that from within my own family.
Wow.
I know, again, I've experienced Christian forgiveness. I've experienced forgiveness from other people. And I think what a lot of people are caught in, especially in their rage and their own hatred, is a need for forgiveness for themselves.
Mm.
And when I recognized my own need for that and how perpetual that is, well, then whatever my beefs are about the history of the church and the sins of the church, because the church does commit sin, the church acknowledges that. And I think that there is in Catholicism a mechanism of self-reflection. Dante put a pope in hell waiting for the current pope to join him. Okay, the church never denounced that poem. All right. And that is often taken, that poem, the Divine Comedy, as the esoteric teachings of the Catholic Church. And there is a remarkable facility in the faith for self-criticism and self-correction, and acknowledging not just one's own sins, but the sins, again, of the larger institution. And so, again, it's been this process of healing. It's not perfect. I still sin. I'm still imperfect, and I still am tempted. And you know, but
Sure. I mean, I think what's really special too, dare I say, Catholicism is the, you know, because you kind of hear the precursor of you need to forgive yourself, but I often think it's more so you need to be forgiven. It's very difficult to sort of conceptualize the idea of self-forgiveness, right? Or like self-love even. People talk about, I've always been like, what the, I love myself. The heck is that, you know? But I can understand the idea of swaddling in the Father's embrace and feeling that warm hug that allows love to emerge, right? Or receiving the forgiveness of God. And I also sense that it's, you know, somebody else so mentioned this in a way in passing to me, was like, you know, forgive others and so God can forgive you, right? So it's like, and also love others so you can receive God's love. And so it's this constant effort to really open up our heart. Gerard really warns us about the bloodlust for violence and tyranny. And it's certainly in me as well. As a man, I think it's sort of rooted, right, in this idea of tyranny. And I do believe there's place for it. I think that we have to have like free rule over a household, for example. And I do think that there's certain elements of like government that needs to be run with the correct sort of figureheads in place and have strict rules around what's not acceptable for the public square. So I do think that there's an element of truth and necessity in that, but the bloodlust for it, the desire for it, the sort of, and also the ridicule as men that we put on ourselves when we don't have a level of authority that we see other men wielding, often, you know, is the feedback loop for us to have self-hatred or to look at ourselves as less because we don't have the access to that much tyranny in our life. We don't have any household to be king over, so to speak, right? Or we can't really rule over our homes because our women are masculinized and aren't really subjugating to us except for maybe in their whoredom in the bedroom. And what's interesting, what you said before, right, is that like with the whore is what I often notice is that the woman in that category of whore is sort of giving herself to the male, right? In essence, the whore is really allowing the male to sort of have his way with her, and in her way of doing so, she's also in some way masculinizing herself. And so I talk to friends of mine, I go, you know, if you're in a relationship with a woman who is coming at you from this sort of mindset of the whore, know that she's gonna be that for you in the bedroom, but dominate you outside of the bedroom, right? So it's this sort of masculinized female embodiment that we're all getting the brunt of, that's encapsulating the world right now.
Yeah.
So, you know, moving through this and also like kind of bringing it back again to religion, and of course, like looking at something along the lines of the enlightened feminine, which is like Sophia or wisdom and grace, and of course, hearkening to the Mother of God as well, with all those different elements of wisdom and grace. You know, the truth lies, I think, in the embodiment of the Catholic faith, and the continuation of the grace that's kind of happened in the human culture and human civilization. And I want to really kind of encourage people to explore that without putting a heavy hand on it. Again, I'm saying this not as a fervent Catholic myself, but rather as a person that's understanding the nature of reality. Right. So how do we escape this desire for violence that's deeply embedded in us that makes us feel guilty when we anger at a friend? How do we move away from that? And how do we embrace the more loving aspects of our nature? And I think that's the real work. I mean, that's the work that Gerard's calling us to, is to not just go into bloodlust, right? To feed the bloodlust for violence and revenge, but how to forgive and move away from violence. And especially now, it's imperative, I think, to like really kind of have a very hard stop on violence in our life. You know, to sort of not see it as a prime way of surviving, but rather like, you know, choose something grace more so than forgiveness. So
returning to the church has very much helped me to lay my anger aside and to recognize that anger is one of the 7 deadly sins. And to realize also that if I'm looking at anger or contempt, hatred, if I'm looking at others with these being the primary experience of them, as beyond love, and including things like lust or anything, you know, without love or charity, maybe it was a more accurate word, being the primary experience of them, then I'm sinning.
And that's really it. So, gosh, I think that's a good place to kind of end it with our conversation for today. I just want to thank you so much for being present with everything that you shared. I think that people are going to get tremendous value out of all the things that you put out. And I'm excited for your book to hit the airways and to be in the hands of people that can dive into it, because, you know, this information might be, I think the people in the truther community, it's like, it's, you know, they kind of all hear the stuff, the conspiracy stuff. But I think when it's written down in academic fashion and it goes out into the world, for just anyone to be able to access, I think that could be huge.
Absolutely.
You know,
Thank you, Drew. I appreciate
yeah,
it. Great
yeah,
talking, as
yeah. I'm
always.
looking forward to another chat with you. All right.
Me too.
Thank you so much for coming by again. Okay, Tom. Talk to you later.
God bless. Talk to you
Okay,
soon.
God bless. Yep. Bye.